Welcome to the American Security Council Protecting Our Freedoms podcast. The mission of the American Security Council is to educate and engage American citizens on national security matters, economic security matters, and the need for moral leadership in the United States of America. Please enjoy the podcast.
Welcome to Protecting Our Freedoms podcast. I'm your host, Joy Votrobek. New on today's Protecting Our Freedoms podcast with me is Mark Renehan.
Hello,
Mark.
Thank you, Joy. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here.
Mark, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I actually have just come from a different podcast. I was the host of the Step Up America Foundation podcast. We were a podcast that celebrated all Americans. From veterans to athletes to musicians, basically just interesting people. Some guests that you might have heard of. We had the Blue Angels on. We had NASA Hall of Fame astronaut Dr. Franklin Chang Diaz on. We had the star of Shock Week, Dr. Greg Scomal on. So we had a very interesting and a little bit of a different show than this. But I do have some background with the American Security Council Foundation. Years ago, I was on the board, and I have recently started working again, and I am looking forward to helping you out with any podcast that you do, Joy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate being here.
No problem. Thank you.
And we have back with us today Dr. Scott Tilley. He has the technical power on our under position papers on our website. You can view his latest article called Ransomware there. We are going to discuss ransomware today. Welcome back, Scott.
Good afternoon, everyone.
I believe Mark has a question for you, Scott, regarding ransomware.
Well, Scott, I am going to be perfectly honest and tell you that I am not exactly what they would call technologically savvy. In any company I have ever worked for, I am the absolute bane of the existence of every IT man. As Lane, our IT guy here, will tell you, I drive him insane. Now, a lot of people hear of ransomware and extortion, and they're not 100% certain as to what it is. And I was hoping briefly, before we get into the meat and the technical aspects of what you do, you could maybe give us just a really brief explanation of what ransomware is and how we could look out for it, etc.
Sure. Well, you think of ransomware as literally two words put together: ransom and ware, like software, hardware, all referring to something related to a computer. The notion of what ransomware is nothing new. In fact, it's been in play for over 20 years in the computer world. But the best analogy I could think of is kidnapping. So when people actually kidnap someone and they're held for ransom. And the kidnappers, of course, demand payment from the people concerned, whether it's individuals or government, depending on what it is they've kidnapped or stolen, for payment to basically get back those goods, people, whatever it might be. In the ransomware setting, what is being stolen is not people, it's not hardware, it's not jewels or anything like that. It's something actually, arguably more important these days, and it's data. So it is data, and it's not being stolen because you can't really literally lift it out of the computer like you can a person, throw them in a car and race off somewhere. What happens is hackers are able to enter a corporate network or a government network, a computer network. And they gain access to the computers on that network and the servers that are storing all the data, and they encrypt that data. And they encrypt it with a key that only they know. And it's quite strong encryption, so it's not like the average person could go in and fix the problem. And then the ransom part is they then send you emails saying, we've encrypted your data. They might occasionally delete it as well, but typically they just encrypt it simply because it's easier. They don't have to load it and unload it. And they say, if you pay us $1 million, whatever it might be, we will send you the key so that you can decrypt your data and gain access to it. When the data is encrypted, all your programs that you're used to, everything from word processing to accounting software and personnel management, whatever it might be, it's completely useless because it can't access and manipulate the data because it's encrypted. So that's what ransomware is in kind of a nutshell.
Scott, so quick question. Let's say XYZ company, and I have been the victim of ransomware, and as you just stated, they demand payment to unencrypt it. What's to stop them if I am to pay them from saying, yeah, you know what, I've decided I'm not going to unencrypt it, pay me more? Is that something that obviously people have to deal with on a regular basis?
They do. In this case, there's not a lot of honor amongst thieves. So you're never quite sure that you're going to get the right key to decrypt your data. It really is a terrible situation because many, as we'll talk about, many of the organizations that end up getting hacked are not really well prepared from an IT point of view, and they don't really have any choice other than just to, on a wing and a prayer, send the payment and hope that they're going to get the right key to decrypt their data. Now they typically do get the right key, but it does happen that you get either no key or the wrong key, and it doesn't decrypt what you're looking for.
And Scott, didn't that just recently happen with Colonial Pipeline? And they did pay the ransom, but did not receive the key?
Exactly right. So Colonial Pipeline is actually the main example I used in my column in July about ransomware. And they're the pipeline that provides the main pipeline that goes from the Midwest all the way to the Northeast coast, North Carolina and north, for all of our fuel. And it's amazing when you think that most of our fuel for such a densely populated area of our country is dependent on one pipeline. I mean, we can also ship stuff by trucks and rail and so on, but pipelines are, of course, the most efficient way of shipping fuel. And the control system for Colonial Pipeline was hacked. Now, it was hacked by a group of folks that are in Eastern Europe, likely backed or at least let to work, if you want, by nation states like Russia, because it was very, very sophisticated. And what they demanded was $5 million payment from Colonial Pipeline. So, I mean, if as an individual, you typically wouldn't be getting extorted for $5 million for your data because, what do people want? Your photos on your computer? I mean, it's typically not that valuable. But in this case, it was all the data that was being used to control the pipelines, where the fuel flows and everything else. Interesting information related to Colonial Pipeline's customers, their contracts, their individual terms of service, which would be different from different people. They said, if you don't do it, not only will we not decrypt your data, we're going to make it public. That's happened, for example, a couple of years ago with Sony, when all of many of their contracts between the president of Sony at the time and some of their, top tier talent was made public because they just released it. And it was like, whoa, that really shouldn't be out in the public. So in this case, Colonial Pipeline had no choice. They actually did pay the $5 million. Although they were working with the authorities, the FBI and so on. And when they got the key didn't work. So they were only able to recover the functionality of the control systems for the pipeline by going through backups.
And that brings me to my first point. So thankfully, they did have a backup.
So one thing I mentioned in the article, and I've written about it many times, is backups are never important until you need them, and then they're absolutely essential. They're like insurance policies, right? So everyone, from individual users to small enterprises to large corporations, I think now more than ever realize the importance of having backups, and they've gone through the exercise of recovering from a backup, like physically and on the network. What do they have to do? What does the IT department have to do to basically restart the entire system from a backup? And of course, that's assuming that A, there is backup, and B, the backup itself wasn't hacked, which is typically why it's wise to have a different company manage your backups for you, so that it's not easy for one hacker to get into another network. So they may have compromised you, but not them.
Scott, I don't mean to interrupt you, but the way I'm looking at this now is it's almost a two-pronged attack, meaning that someone can seize control of your systems, and then they can say, if you want you want your system back, you're going to pay us, but also we will expose what's on your system. And I think to some people that would be even more of a, like you said, with Sony, they exposed all of their celebrities and actors and stuff like that. So it's almost a two-pronged attack. And my next question is, I know you're speaking of they have to have a key that is delivered to them to open it. Now, I know large corporations and companies obviously would hire someone almost like yourself. So let's say I'm Mark Renehan, and Mark Renehan Industries gets ransomware, and they are offering me a key. Is there any way that I could contact, for example, you and say, listen, I've just been hit with ransomware, and can you come and make that key yourself, or are these keys just stuck with the attackers?
So typically the attackers that are going to go after large corporations, they're pretty sophisticated in the sense that the software they're using to encrypt your data, basically to scramble it, uses what are called long keys. They're very long. Imagine you have not one house key, but you've got multiple house keys, on your front door, and you need all the keys to be able to get in. There's actually in this whole chain of events, if you want, the main people who are hacking you and then approaching you to say, you must pay us X number of dollars, they don't always need to know how the system works. They've bought it on the dark web. Other people sell it. It's a whole industry of selling these tools. So they don't necessarily need to know how to work it properly. They just need to know how to install it on your system. Whether or not you could decrypt it, well, unless you're probably a 3-letter agency, no. You really are kind of stuck, which is why I mentioned in the column that our national policy when it comes to kidnapping and terrorism, ransom, is that we don't pay ransom. That's our policy. In the real world, of course, different things happen. In the online world, where ransomware occurs, most companies end up paying because it's really difficult to be able to decrypt something that's been encrypted using these large keys if you don't have a key. You'd be running your computers like almost forever to be able to decrypt the data. And during that time, your whole enterprise is basically stuck, right? We're so dependent on these systems to be working. And we're not talking just things like pipelines. These could be like nuclear power plants, schools, hospitals, library systems. I mean, you name it.
My next question was going to be, does the country, so let's, like you said, a threat could be, if somehow ransomware was done to a Pentagon or an institute like that. Does the United States have I know we don't negotiate with terrorists. Do we not negotiate with ransomware, or is that on a case-by-case basis?
It's a bit of both. It's one of those things that it's very likely we're not going to make public how we deal with it. It is definitely a national security issue for sure right now. The current administration has a new task force related to ransomware, in addition to our cybersecurity command and, for a variety of other agencies that are, kind of working behind the scenes, and thank goodness they are. One of the largest purchasers, however, of ransomware is a kind of a form of software that is sometimes called malware, as in, bad software, malware. And as I mentioned, a lot of these programs, whether or not they're viruses, that'll go around your network and erase your data or hold it for ransom by encrypting it, is under this big umbrella of malware. And as I said, if you poke around enough, and I don't suggest you do it, but if you poke around enough on what is called the dark web, where all these things are bought and sold, one of the biggest purchasers of them is the U.S. government, because they buy them to keep them off the market.
Well, thankfully, Scott, I can barely get into my email, so I will not be poking around any dark webs. That being said, Scott, we here at the American Security Council Foundation, we believe in peace through strength. Obviously, it's our motto here. I was curious, who do you think, if you were, let's say you were Scott and you were with the North Koreans or an enemy of America, I don't want to throw out, what's something that they could attack that would make you, Scott Tilley, incredibly worried for our country's safety? Meaning, could they attack our electrical infrastructure? Could they attack something that might control our satellites? What do you think? And by the way, if you can't talk about this, and I apologize, I don't know all of the security protocols, but what to you or to the average American citizen, what would be the biggest issue to worry about, and what would be ransom attack that I would be concerned with?
It's a very good question. I'll try and answer it as much as I can in general terms. I would say things like the power grid would be one. We're in Florida, sweltering in the heat. Imagine when we get hit by a hurricane and we lose power for a week. It immediately becomes like Lord of the Flies around here. People swarming Walmart and trying to get water and going nuts. I remember all the gas stations don't work. Think about everything that relies upon the power grid right now. It literally is everything in our life. Hospitals. And although we have backup systems, diesel generators and what have you, they eventually run out. So if they were able to attack something like the power grid, it would be terrible. Other things you kind of mentioned, for example, our satellites. Well, that would knock out and disable, for example, all of our GPS systems, both civilian and military, or some of them anyway. That would be an inconvenience. For some companies, it would be an absolute necessity, like trucking companies and so on. So it's basically our fundamental infrastructure, which unfortunately is the most vulnerable because they're not security hardened enough yet, and almost everything these days is connected to some network, and if it's on a network, it can be hacked. It doesn't matter what people will tell you that, it's, we're totally secure. You're not. There's always someone who has enough knowledge or wherewithal or insider knowledge or connections to be able to get in. It goes, think of all the way back to the Middle Ages. And, when one country laid siege or a king laid siege to another king's castle, and you had a moat around the castle, and you had all these, boiling oil and all the other stuff to try and protect it. But the easiest way in the castle was actually to pay someone and bribe them and get in through the back door, right? Then why fight when you can just walk in? Unfortunately, a lot of the things related to cybersecurity are the same. I would refer you to a classic book by Kevin Mitnick on what is called basically social engineering. If you want to get into a network, pick up the phone and call someone in the company and pretend you're their bank or their whoever, and say, by the way, we just need your PIN number to get in, and boom, they're in.
Scott,
why hack it when you can just talk on the phone?
Scott.
Yes.
Oh, there. I wasn't sure if you could hear me. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you had said about Florida, for example, and Mark, I don't know if you remember, but in Oldsmar, I think it's called, over near Tampa, recently they had tried to hack into their water system. And the guy that was operating it thankfully saw the mouse literally just moving without him.
Yeah, so that was a very, very low-tech hack. It was actually from a kid in the Tampa area who was hacking into a relatively small water supply system and filtration system. But what he was able to do was change the chemical mix of the filtration system to dramatically increase the amount of lye, L-Y-E, that is used to purify water, which went from making the water drinkable to making it toxic. And that was about to be released. And that's just here. It was all because the water company had a software system installed on their control panels that allowed managers to remotely access the system. So when they're traveling or they're at home or whatever, to be able to basically change the controls on it as if they were sitting in front of it. Now, that kind of software is very, very common. But when it's being used over almost an open network and a very easy way to crack the initial password, then if that one guy by chance hadn't seen the fact that this kid was manipulating the system, many people would have been sick or died. So that's an example of, if you think about that and you extrapolate that across our entire country, how many places are doing water and, as I said, electricity, the grid, all kinds of parts of our fundamental infrastructure are all now networked. And if they're networked, they're hackable.
Well, Scott, that's my next question. So in today's, completely technological world, I know that there are things like, for example, the Zoom camera that you would see, people have at their front doorbell. I know like video games, my nephews love to play their video games. These are all connected wirelessly to the internet. I know like a smart TV. Can ransomware, is it sophisticated enough? And I'm assuming that there are people who are sophisticated enough that can use those systems to maybe even hack, just your neighbor's house, for example. Could they hack into a Zoom camera, hack into their wireless, and seize control and things like that? Or is it more basically just for larger corporations?
Well, it's a bit of both. It depends on the scale and the nature of the people who are doing the hacking and what their goals are. But one of the examples you gave are those doorbells like Ring from Amazon and others. Yes, those have been known to have multiple security vulnerabilities. So therefore, they're relatively easy to hack if you have the right tools. Why would you want to hack someone's doorbell, for example, or their inside security cameras? Well, it's been done to harass people, to take over their inside camera and start saying, by the way, I've seen everything you've been doing in your bedroom, and I'm going to post it if you don't, because you put it in there maybe because you wanted to watch it for babysitting purposes or something, and it captures everything. The police, in fact, rely on the fact that some of these things are hackable to get information of what's happening on the outside road. Because if you look at the average neighborhood, wherever we live here in Florida, a huge number of people have doorbell cameras on their front door, and they're used in the aggregate as kind of a surveillance system. Usually by the owners say, okay, you can use it because after all, you want to catch the bad guys. But the broader problem you're describing here is sometimes called the Internet of Things, or IoT. And the Internet of Things are basically devices that are connected to the internet. Doorbells, cell phones, televisions, cameras. And the reason why this is giving hackers more opportunity to get into our homes and our businesses is that many of these devices are developed, not here, developed in China and other places, and they're developed by companies whose their focus is not security. It's not on good software engineering and computer science. It's making relatively cheap hardware, which we then sell here, and it rarely gets updated. They're usually hard to update. Especially for the average person. I mean, when's the last time you did a firmware update for your router?
Never.
Right.
Scott,
exactly. Right. You're like, what's a firmware update? Exactly. So once there's a known vulnerability, it's easy to exploit it and continually exploit it because these pieces of hardware and software together in a device aren't updated. I think the last time I counted actually went up to, I think I have now 54 internet-connected devices in my home.
I think we talked about that last time, and I think Americans have that need for convenience, and they like that convenience, but it also puts us in a bad spot, as well as these managers, like you were talking about with the Olsner case, that are able to remotely access the water system. And now with the pandemic, many people working from home need to access, so that makes us vulnerable.
Yeah, so I would suggest for everyone who's listening, just think about it. Just write down on some paper, walk around your home. Think about how many devices do I actually have that are connected to your either a cellular network, because that's hackable too, or like your Wi-Fi router that comes from Spectrum or whoever it might be, your dish or whatever it might be. So there's even been cases where people have hacked into their thermostat. And so I'm going to set your house at 99 degrees unless you pay me.
That in Florida, that's unacceptable. I would pay you anything you want. Scott, so here's a question I have. I'm Joe Q Public. I just listened to this podcast, and suddenly I'm a little concerned about ransomware and that my Ring camera might get whatever.
Yep.
Are there any simple steps that you could recommend to the average citizen who might be listening on how to secure their wireless network? I know obviously you have, your passwords and you can change them, but is there anything that people might not realize that you might know that you could recommend?
Well, you mentioned passwords. So almost all homes now have, let's say I'll use mine as an example. So my internet access comes from my cable company, which means I basically have two devices that are the portal, if you want, between my home and the outside world. And that is the modem, which is connected to the cable, and then the Wi-Fi router, which is broadcasting the wireless signal. And both of those devices ship with default passwords, right? It's usually something as silly as admin. So ID is admin, password is admin. And people know this. And, if you're talking to your grandmother or something, say, well, grandma, go online, go to the browser, go to this address, change the password. At that point, it's like, what? I have no idea. And typically when the companies come and install this stuff, they don't change it. So it's up to the user to be able to do it, or call call your grandchild, call some IT service, call someone who knows how to change the password so that this is basically the lock on your front door. That would be the analogy. Without changing that password, you basically are leaving your front door unlocked all the time, even open, because the same password is used on these literally millions of devices. So number one would be to do that. The second would be probably the way most of us buy things these days, and that is based on reviews, right? When you go online, other people's experience with whatever the product might be really influences whether or not you're going to buy it or not. And if you read enough, you might start seeing news stories or news articles about whether or not these devices were hacked and where they're coming from. So many of these devices, like doorbells and so on, I would trust more from coming from large companies than small companies that I've never heard of, because it's likely that they are totally open. I wouldn't do that either. The third thing I just wanted to mention that's not quite related to protecting yourself, and that is when you're in ransomware, when you're paying the ransom, you're typically paying in a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. And the reason why, of course, the bad guys do this is that things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and there's a pile of others, are untraceable by design. So the FBI was able to get back some of the $5 million that Colonial Pipeline paid, but in general, it's untraceable and it's gone, which is why the baddies like it, because it's not exactly going to be reported on their 1040. It's just it's illegal money that they're basically laundering using Bitcoin to fund other activities, and eventually, at some point, in some, we'll call it a understanding country, allows them to convert it back to an actual hard currency. So there's another problem related to this ransomware, and that has to do with how things are paid.
That was a good question, Mark, because when this is protecting our freedom, so the average person needs to understand how to protect their passwords and different things that are connected at home, Internet of Things, as you say.
Yeah.
And the cryptocurrency, that's becoming a little more common even to the average American these days. So do you see any regulation coming out of this?
Well, a number of countries have talked about formalizing and regulating cryptocurrencies. A number of companies now allow you to, you can even buy real estate in Bitcoin if you want. You've been able to do that for a couple of years now. I think it's coming, but I don't think it's quite ready yet, because obviously, federal agencies would like to be able to track and control cryptocurrencies like the U.S. dollar or other baskets of currencies that we use to evaluate and measure, the relative worth of each nation. After we got rid of the gold standard, the value of our currency is only relative to some other country's currency and our inherent wealth. Cryptocurrencies are not like that at all. They're completely different. Their wealth, actually, the relative value has to do with algorithms that are run on computers to be able to generate new like say Bitcoins, which is why you have many really old cities that were like mining cities, especially ones that are up north, that are now converted to, they were called digital mining operations for all these computers to churn out new Bitcoins. Because every single day it gets harder and harder and harder to be able to create one coin. And of course, it's not a physical coin, it's just a monetary unit. So there's no doubt that many governments, ours included, are looking into Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, but I don't think the general public is quite ready for them yet. I personally have avoided them completely.
So, Scott, I have another question for you. As we are about protecting our freedoms here, and this just hit me, and I hope I'm going to be wrong on this, but could a ransomware attack happen against our military? Meaning, could the Army have its, I'm not 100% how it works, but could the Army, the Navy, or more importantly, like the Space Force, have their system ransomware attacked and frozen and leave our forces obviously not completely incapable, but I know that without GPS, without the different tracking systems, without the targeting systems, we would be reduced to, obviously we still have tanks, guns, bullets, but is that something that an enemy of the United States is probably looking at? I'm sure our military is prepared for that, but would that be for lack of a better term, would that be a great target if I was an enemy of the United States of America? I mean, I have to imagine if I could somehow freeze the United States military network, that would, leave us very vulnerable to attack. Is that something that, A, people should be worried about, B, has been looked into already? I just was wondering if you could touch base on that briefly.
Great question.
Well, again, I'll try and do it generally, not specifically. It's definitely something that the military and our government agencies are well aware of and are actively defending against. The difference is, so the short answer is yes, it could happen. And bad things could happen unless we're defending well against it. Thankfully, most of our military systems are hardened in that sense that they have a much more layers of security involved in both the process and the hardware and software than maybe some of our commercial enterprises, because the results of hacking into missile command or something would be terrible. The challenge, however, is that in a cybersecurity setting, the defenders, and that would be, for example, our military trying to make sure that no one gets into our network, have to work 100% of the time. The attackers only have to succeed once, and then they're in. So it's an asymmetrical challenge and attack. And the other difference, of course, is compared to previous versions of conflict, is if you wanted to attack some aspect of the U.S. military, you had to do it with comparable hardware and personnel. Now you just need a couple of people sitting in a room in anywhere in the world with an internet connection. So the costs of doing it are almost nothing. And if they don't get in one time, just keep hammering and hammering, which happens to our institutions every single day. We've learned to kind of deflect them, but it's just so cheap to be able to try and get into them from afar. So all of these attackers, whether they're nation states or sophisticated little groups like the ones who attacked Colonial Pipeline, they can be sitting anywhere with a good internet connection, and we can't actually. Sometimes you can't even identify where they are, but if you can, I'm not sure. It's not clear what to do about them, other than launch your own counterattack against them on a cyber level.
Scott, you jumped right ahead of me because I was going to ask you that. Circling back to your Biden administration's ransomware task force, what are your thoughts on the task force option to hack back or disrupt cybersecurity gangs?
Yeah, so hacking back is kind of like using the same tools that they're using against us backwards. And for a company, they probably would be reluctant to do that because they may be opening themselves up to all kinds of weird legal implications. For a nation state or a government organization, they may choose to do it. But one of the downsides of that sort of defense, if you want, is that because it's so easy for the attackers to get into a network, what's to say if you start poking them, they'll just go to some other part of your enterprise, your organization, and do the exact same thing again. Because sometimes it's unclear how they got there. It's unclear how long they've been lurking in your network. The SolarWinds example we talked about a couple of months ago, they were lurking there from March to December, and no one knew. Eventually, SolarWinds was a hack that's called a supply chain hack, and they weren't doing much, but they were just watching. It's like lurking in the network and watching all the data go back and forth. But the hack was installed, I think, in March and only detected in December. And it affected over 18,000 organizations. I mean, a huge number, including many of our three-letter agencies, including like the Department of Justice. And they could have been doing a lot worse than simply watching and copying data. They could have disabled the systems, just in a true ransomware attack. And the irony is, the company that finally identified this large-scale intrusion was themselves a security company who had been hacked. One of our leading security companies. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of irony there. Thank goodness they had a lot of good people there, but it still took that long. So you might ask, Mark asked, could our systems be infiltrated now? Well, for all we know, some of them might already be. They're really getting quite sophisticated in terms of detecting, sort of these anomalies in the network. I don't think it's something that the average person should stay awake at night worrying about, because we pay a lot of people to do that for us.
But Mark brought up a good point about our military, and you did as well, Scott, saying that this is kind of a new age. It's a hybrid warfare, if you would say, or gray zone, where we don't know all the time exactly where to pinpoint where it's coming from.
Yep. So it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. You don't need a giant army. You don't need all the hardware. As I said, some of the attacks that we know of that were coming previously were coming from one building in Shanghai. That's it. A few guys working away there, the other side of the world, and having a large impact on a lot of different financial institutions. Yeah, and so it's a lot cheaper because it's what's sometimes referred to as asymmetrical warfare, right?
Well, let me ask you in a more humor, I guess, type of question here for you, Scott. Disney World, Scott, of course, a Florida attraction that we all know and love. I believe a lot of their systems are probably linked online. Could ransomware get in and shut down Space Mountain when I'm about to go on a roller coaster dip, or do you think that that's possible? Can they literally get into anything that's connected to the internet?
So I have to be careful about answering this one. I don't know about Space Mountain or Disneyland in particular. Disneyland, I do know, because I know some folks who work there, and I've seen sort of the back end, if you want, of it. They're pretty sophisticated on how they control their stuff. Sometimes when it looks so easy and so much fun, the happiest place on earth, behind the scenes, there's a lot of work going on to make that look like it's very easy, but it's actually not. But the bottom line, however, is that anything that is on the internet can be hacked. Wow. So, as I said before, the analogy would be, all you need is one person in there that says, you know what, I'll give you $100,000. Can you just give me your administrator password? Okay, here you go. Bing, in.
Wow, interesting. All right, one last question for you. I hear you've mentioned the three-letter agencies, and I don't know if this is an answerable question. Is there one particular three-letter agency that deals with ransomware the most over others, or are they all just jumping on board?
There's multiple agencies. It depends on, the FBI would be one example, of course, because especially for domestic stuff, NSA for international issues. One of the big problems with ransomware, and when you put it together with Bitcoin, is that our jurisdiction is limited. If these guys are doing the hacking from somewhere in Eastern Europe, under the umbrella of protection of some nation state over there. It's not like we can send agents over, to knock on their door and arrest them. I mean, we do have things like Interpol and other, extradition treaties and a variety of other things. But unlike, actual kidnapping and actual physical attacks, these sort of things are it's still kind of like the Wild West. So our ability to deter these things, it really comes down more to defense than going after them and trying to prosecute them, until all countries are agree to some sort of agreement, if you want, on why these things are dangerous. But the countries that tend to harbor these are doing it because they know that it's a lot cheaper than actual military might. You just need some really smart people. And in other parts of the world, there are a lot of smart people. And they're incentivized, of course, because maybe their economy's bad, but they're really good hackers, programmers, whatever it might be.
All right, Scott, so speaking of